Thank you very much, Jyoti, for the welcome again. Thanks to all of you, especially Mr. Andrew, Santosh, and certainly Zimba for guiding us through a wonderful time of reflecting upon various issues that came up through the Bible, through your own experiences, and certainly moving. Thank you very much, and I always feel humbled as I listen to these authentic voices coming through the scriptures, coming through the experiences, or like Inba. Thank you very much for this. Dear friends, we would see what we were doing in the last session. I'll try and refresh our memories of what we did yesterday, and then hopefully we'll continue this discussion. And I certainly look forward to your engagement even today. So, if we remember, we started with a few objectives yesterday. A clear objective was to see and perceive Christian ethics from the perspective of stigma regarding sexuality, around sexuality, to discern, especially discern myths. Here, I remember one of the bishops was saying outside that the gift that we have to ask today of the Holy Spirit is the gift of discernment. And this is a valued gift that we need to ask because of the various misconceptions, various myths surrounding communities of sexual orientations and gender identities. Even just an hour earlier, the new master's batch is beginning, and so we met the batch that is studying the master's master studies in Christian ethics. It's a wonderful new group, and then we just went around them asking what their thesis perceptions are, what are their research interests, and then at least a few of the students came quite openly of their own struggle with the idea and perception of sexuality. And of course, they were very honest, and we can see that theological education does certainly need emphasis as well as perceptions on sexuality, because the way in which a clear dominant view is prevailing amongst students. Nothing wrong with that. That's how they come, suggesting that all of what we do and try and perceive here is problematic in a fundamental way for them. And that's why it's so important that we tried at least to embark upon this journey of discerning myths surrounding persons from the SOGI community, sexual orientation and gender identities community, and to listen to the voices of these communities. We began by, if you remember, the initial student questions that reverberate in all of our classes. And as we ended our session, Dr. Prasanna rightly pointed out in the last session of the questions that are asked by our students. And these are genuine questions. These are the struggles that they themselves face. And sometimes it is certainly hard to even convince them. As I said, some of them would graduate with good grades, knowing that they know what their teachers want. And so it's all fine and nice in terms of the grades. But then when they do proceed, it becomes a struggle for them, and they perhaps may not have imbibed anything at all. And then when they do come to their master studies, we hear the same struggles that they had in their first year, which means that they are in this bubble. And then we did go to this methodological question that we were raising in the last session. How does a social, religious, or theological or political culture around the world, in India, in theological institutions, develop so much so to exclude persons of minority sexual orientation, and gender identities from formal community. And the challenge that emerged in the voices of those who have gone before us, those theologians, um, cautioning us, warning us that somehow Christian institutions in Asia, in India, as a song would say, are carrying business as usual without viable alternatives. And Nirmal and others warned us that there is this growing confessionalism in theological institutions that we are to guard against when we have to perceive how sexuality is understood in our own theological institutions. And there were very many challenges that were raised during the past session, especially how religion, doctrine, the sources of theology become the sources of injustice. When we say sources of theology, it is the given, and it's the subject of epistemology, as we said. That's where we receive knowledge from, and that's why we are guided by that particular knowledge system, whatever those sources are. Now, when those sources that we claim to be authentic, that we claim to be passed on through the generations, that we claim to be the sources, now when those sources become sources of injustice, especially against sexual communities, communities of sexual orientation and gender identities, then we need to take a call as to what are the received traditions and how they become sources of injustice. And therefore, we began this important task of demythologizing the so-called moral. And we took help from the social theorist Horkheimer, if you remember, when he suggests that the point of departure for us is the misery of the victim. And that's where we begin and proceed, rather than step as a point of entry being a judgmental position. Okay, the point of entry can be a judgmental position. The point of entry can also be the misery of the victim. And that's why it's this critical choice that is placed before us. Okay. And as we hear from Brueggemann, to choose the divine alternative. Okay, when there are other alternatives available, to be honest and critical of all those other alternatives, and perhaps choose the divine alternative as a point of entry. And therefore, we began by choosing the point of entry very clearly as the misery of the victim, and which gave us the impetus to decenter our epistemologies, if you remember. So what are the epistemic violence that are meted out against persons of gender diversities, and how those epistemic violences are codified, as well as this symbolic violence that emerges from our own classrooms, from our own departments, from our own syllabus, from our own general body meetings. How does this be, and how can we actually identify such epistemic violences that are prevalent in theological education, especially in our theological institutions? And also, going forward with that, we also spoke about cognitive injustice, how Soji knowledge system and practices are challenged or kept aside deliberately, and how we need to see those knowledge systems as body-mediated experiences. We also took the help of the theorist Hannah Arendt. Okay, so Hannah Arendt speaking about this critical difference between morality and certainly of ethics. And we came to a realization much before religion came to be, human societies chose heteronormativity, perhaps because of this evolutionary tendency to survive. not falling into the trap of Darwinianism. That's not what we are trying to say. But then there is this, at least an iota of truth in this, that somehow human communities, in order to survive, bracketed barrenness, impotency, eunuchism, homosexuality as something to be despised, something that goes against morality, because possibly quote unquote procreation is not available there. And that's why they codified that into a religious law. And all, not just Christian texts, but very many across the major religious texts do so condemn barrenness, impotency, eunuchism, and certainly homosexuality. And so this is no surprise at all, given the trajectory of human civilizational development through the ages. And therefore, we need to question that kind of a moral evolution that we have imbibed. Also, we have adopted to be the only way in which we are to do things. And that is where we stop there, I suppose. So now what we would do is we will follow these the same ways of arguments that we had in the previous seminar, to look at what are the dominant readings of Christian ethics in terms of the what we call the heteronormative gaze in India. And then we'll try and see what is the theology in context that we are looking at, especially with reference to sexual ethics. And then we will see how exclusivity plays within Christian ethics today in India as regards gender identities. We may look into one or two theories as well in order to conceptualize this particular way in which we are going. And then, if we do have time, look to scriptures and try and identify how a more liberative reading of the scriptures, as Mr. Andrew wonderfully actually led the Bible study today. We may also look at some aspects of this from the creation narrative, and possibly move towards an intersectional approach in Christian ethics that might broaden our spaces, that might broaden our horizons. So I'll try and share the screen with you. Before that, are there any preliminary questions before we begin? Anything from the previous seminar, or anything that you do have in as a preliminary comment or a clarification? You're most welcome to do it now. Okay, if not, we will certainly take this up again. I hope the screen is visible now. Jyoti, is it okay?
Yeah, it is visible.
Yeah, thank you very much. So look at this dominant reading of Christian ethics that we have, and this is where we stop as to how heteronormativity and the logic of heteronormativity works. We start with this. I began by saying that somehow moral evolution needs to be taken into consideration when we are speaking about religious texts, because moral evolution precedes the religious texts. Okay, religious texts are written, but imagine our oral history and how this particular idea that all other sects
Dr. Alan, are you there? I think there is some technical problem. We lost Dr. Alan, I guess.
I hope that some technical problem. We are also heavily raining in Chennai now. Neil is joining.
Okay.
Meanwhile, friends, maybe we have. I'm looking for one more person to take devotion on 31st. Is there any volunteers? I think all of you have taken some responsibility, except Vincent Vasu and Elizabeth Gill. One of you would like to volunteer for taking devotion on 31st and interviewing your candidate. Hello? Okay, then I will be calling you or I will be writing to you. Please kindly respond to that. Yeah,
Yes.
Alan can come.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for staying. We just had a park cut briefly. I hope it would be okay. Or there are some very strong people of God here who have prayed that I would stop very quickly. And your prayers, I think your prayers were briefly answered. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for staying. Please do allow me to share the screen again. Hopefully this would stay this time. Yes. Jyoti, is it okay? Yeah, is the screen visible, Jyoti?
Yeah, screen is visible now.
Okay, thank you very much. See the progression of thought, dear friends, how heteronormity is imbibed within our own logic. So this is how the logic goes as to why we somehow think that there can be no other sexual orientations or no other gender identities that can be present. Of course, this is the base consideration. So if we encounter students, especially in the first 2 years, we find this basic argument that there can not be any other identities or any other orientation simply because of this binary world that they are exposed to. Okay, this clear binary position that there can be only two identities that is possible. And of course they might say quote unquote hermaphrodite, they might say, and then they might get away with that. But generally this is so. Why? Because of this logic, is that you see this evolutionary thinking that reproduction is good, and in order for that, sex is good, and in order to have that within the community and within the society, marriage is required, and that's why marriage is good. And for marriage, male and female are necessary sexual counterparts. And this is how the logic. So the male and female, and therefore marriage, and therefore sex, and therefore reproduction. And therefore, it leads us to this conclusion that same-sex sexual relations are problematic in a fundamental way because it does not contribute to this logic. This, not just this logic, but a societal affirmation, which again is the only accepted way in which societies can function across the societies around the world. And that is why we are to understand that if we go to religious texts for guidance, we may not get many, because those religious texts developed as part of this human moral evolution that despise same-sex relationship as well as gender identities as being problematic. And that is why it is but natural that such a worldview, such a perspective, such a heteronormative position is taken. Okay, and as I said, it is but natural, and certainly religion legitimizes such a logic, and also religion gifts this particular logic that male and female are necessary sexual counterparts because marriage is good and sex is good, of course leading to procreation. And procreation has been the benchmark of blessing, not just within the Christian tradition, but also across the religious tradition. So if we are to understand and engage with the idea of procreation through major religious texts, as well as minor religious texts as well, we may perhaps get this as a single benchmark. And it is no doubt that we find the same heteronormative gaze in India today within religious studies. And we can say that there is this predominant moralized heteronormative character to not just philosophy and religious studies, but also specifically theological studies, Christian studies in India. It's because of this tradition, and theological education is a continuation of that moral thinking, and it is an extension of that moral thinking, and it is again but logical that theological education carries this heteronormative character even today, except for the courses that are initiated by the National Council of Churches in India within the Senate of Serampur schema. If we go through all other theological college syllabuses, education syllabuses, whether it be offered by very many other universities, Christian universities in India, we would say that this is certainly a marginalized text, marginalized syllabus. And certainly excluded in very many, simply because that it is immoral even to think about it, even to discuss about it, even to have it as a course outline. Very recently, because of the insistence of the NCCI through the efforts of the Isha, at least one or two courses have been finally added. So that is recent. So imagine the scope as well as the struggle that theological education needs to undergo in order to even think about discussing this. And that's why it is certainly right to say that there is clearly a heteronormative gaze in India today, which furthers us this question as to this even thinking of out of this arena is not possible. It is not even acknowledged, as we say. And that's why what we need now is an oppositional gaze, as Foucault and others would say, an oppositional gaze from the Soji perspective, which is critical to theological education today. And how we consider that, because when we look at theology in context, as we all know, this is just how would say an echoing of all our concerns, our rightful concerns, when we bring to this, that the context of ministry, the context of theological education is invariably in the context of the unjust empire. This unjust empire would trace itself, would probably in many ways project itself in various forms, whether it be patriarchy, whether it be the power struggles, whether it be even heteronormativity as an unjust empire. And this is the context that we are facing in. And the one way in which we have to deal with is this identifying this close interrelationship between justice, justification, and reconciliation as the character of theological research today. The Gurukul Lutheran Theological College there, they have their special emphasis from the Lutheran point of view. And when we celebrated the 500th year just about in 2017, as you know, and our entire way we look at it is to see this unimaginable, incredible connection between justice, justification, and reconciliation as the character with which we do theological research, irrespective of our doctrinal affirmations, our doctrinal allegiances, if I were to say it, because remember, confessionalism has taken over very many of theological institutions around the world, and the prospect of confessionalism is that we would at least would like to revisit some of our faith affirmations. That is the prospect. But the challenge or the problem of confessionalism is that we might fall into the trap of moral evolution that we were speaking about, even in terms of our doctrinal affirmations. And that's why character should be certainly justice, justification, and reconciliation. And task, therefore, of social ethics as we discern the theological worldview of relationality and interconnectedness of Soji communities, and to lead to be critical of heteronormative Christian history, theology, and ethics. That's the larger interest is the most, I would say, the difficult, but rather challenging aspect of what we do today. To be critical of heteronormative received Christian history, received theology, and certainly Christian ethics. And this ethics of self-identity of Soji communities should be the beginning in which we explore how Christian ethics is at the juncture wherein which it really needs to choose these alternatives that are there in front of us. Very many years ago, Karl Barth gave this wonderful illustration of how we need to see God, because it finally comes to how our perception of the divine is. And that is where our perception of the divine leads us to the doctrinal affirmations. And those doctrinal affirmations trickle through Christian history, Christian theology, and certainly Christian ethics. And you would certainly know this wonderful symbol that Karl Barth offered us in terms of imagining what God can be. And I certainly share this in class. One or two of our friends are here who certainly have heard this image that comes from Karl Barth. Karl Barth spoke about this. He said that it is comparable to a bird in flight in contrast to a caged bird. The God of the gospel rejects any connection with a theology that has become paralyzed and static. Paralyzed and static. To imagine a God who is forever moving. And so as soon as we codify our theology, that becomes static, that becomes paralyzed. And even that we offer that to our own students because of our own inhibitions, because of our own prejudice, we are gifting the students with this paralyzed and static theology, which certainly is far from what God would certainly expect of all of us, because as being this image, God is forever in flight. It's like this painting that as soon as we paint a picture of God, of the flying bird, that painting becomes static. And which means that our being as an artist, as being as a painter, we need to keep painting. We need to change our canvas every time in order to even capture this God who is forever in flight. And therefore, if our theology has become heteronormative, paralyzed, and static, it is time to tear that canvas apart and start again. And we do this all the time. And every academic year gives us this fresh impetus to begin again, to start afresh, to reconsider whatever we have done, to, as we say, to reimagine a newer way of looking at it as to what God is wanting us to do in this world. This is one book that I have found to be very moving, as well as that which we can read and have to read. And Miriam, if you may have referred to this, certainly, Amartya Sen's Identity and Violence. This book has implications for what is happening in our country, what is happening to the world order at the moment, wherein which a clear dominant idea is gaining grounds, whether it be socially, religiously, or politically. So this, through this particular work by Amartya Sen, throws light on what is the fundamental challenge that our world faces, not just in terms of how we look at things politically or socially or economically or religiously, but much more, as I said, in a fundamental, most rudimentary way as to what is the challenge that our world faces. And within this book, he says, of course, the certain emphasis is mine, as I have suggested. Sen goes further to say in this book, but there is a big difference about why the cultivation of singularity is so successful, given the extraordinary naivete of that thesis in a world of obvious plural affiliations. So Amartya Sen is saying that we all know that there is something called plurality. The world is plural. Our relations are plural. Our identities are plural. Our sexualities as well as genders are plural. And that's why we say identities, orientations. They're all plural. But Amartya Sen goes further and says, we all know, it is obvious that there are plural affiliations. But why? Why is it that the cultivation of singularity is successful, is so successful? Whether it is that this is the only way in which it should be. This is how it is. Whether it's the cultivation of this idea of only binaries, as it were. Only that sexuality that we know is correct or truthful. So why is it that people hold to this very strongly? And this leads to this very questioning of why Christian ethics holds this exclusive position every time. And as we know that exclusivity is not simply economic and biological, it is moral and spiritual. We take recourse to Lewis, who said that there is this evacuation of divine meaning. I always say this in class as well, and I'm never tired of that. We thingify people, as we say, as others would say, to make a certain one a thing, and then we don't associate divine meaning in that person or an identity or an orientation, and that is why we can pose not just physical violence, but certainly epistemic violence against those people, because we have evacuated divine meaning from them. We don't see divine meaning in orientations. We don't see divine meaning in identities. And that is why that becomes an exclusive matter for us. And it's easier for people to be disregarded. It's easier for people to be pushed aside because we don't necessarily identify divine meaning in these communities, and we would only see them from the perspective of our own moral standards, our own moral standards. And when that judgmental moral standard comes into being, comes into play, then there is evacuation of divine meaning. We take the divine out. And I always give this example that when we were young and we were in school, whenever a book dropped from the desk, or accidentally when we would touch a book with our feet, we would take that and do all sorts of things to, okay, to possibly ask forgiveness from the book. I don't know, because we attached divine meaning to that book. We attached the divine meaning, even if it was a thing. And that is why there was a respect even towards a thing, supposedly a lifeless object. A book is a lifeless object. But because of the association of divine meaning, we would be respectful. We would take that. Imagine people, imagine identities. When we do not associate divine meaning in those, in the people and identities and orientations, it becomes easier for us to be exclusive. It's easier for us to be heteronormative, because we are in the right plane. We are in the high moral ground. We claim that ground from, as I said, from our own doctrinal as well as faith orientations. And that is the moral ground in which we stay. And that moral ground helps us, quote unquote, helps us to evacuate divine meaning. I won't go further into this. I would certainly recommend a reading by Jean-Luc Nancy, who speaks about this dissolution of community, how a community becomes dissolved, why we won't identify some people as being part of the community, and why do we identify only one part of them as being from the community. And this is what is the anxiety that we face today in terms of the dissolution of community. And that's why an alternative view of community is necessary. It proposes that a community of being, the irreducible plurality of singular ones. Sorry to be a little philosophical on this, and for those who are from other departments, yeah, I do imagine that these can be a little bit off the shelf, as it were. But then there is a deep meaning that comes to us, that how do we conceive of this very identity as well as perception of what a community is, and what is the becoming of that community, whether it be sexuality or gender for that matter. And so I won't dwell on that. We'll come to this when we do have time, knowing that just have an eye on the time, and that is why we'll go directly to the creation narrative. I've shared this very many times. We contribute to this particular perception to the NCCI module on sexuality for the church. Okay, so there is a module that the NCCI developed for the church, wherein which the church can look up this module with very many activities, simple activities, group activities, wherein which this module can be a handbook or a reference book for those who are interested in bringing up awareness on sexuality in churches. So this is a part that we contributed to that module, and within that module we read the creation story in a creative way, in an imaginative way, which you may perhaps have done as well, which gives us a very important idea of reimagining divine meaning in our books. So if we are to read Christian ethical reading of creation beyond duality, that's where our students begin. And that's where they refer to. All this would say is that, yes, everything is fine and nice, but what do you think of Genesis 1:26? Isn't that clear? Isn't that unequivocal? There is no two voices with regard to that in saying that God created human beings as male and female, full stop. And then they would argue that God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and
Steve.
yeah,
Steve.
exactly. But who made Steve? Who did make Steve? If
God did.
that's right. So this is, thank you very much for this. This is what happens, okay? That there is not, but can duality be questioned within the schema? Because that is a logical development with which Adam and Eve certainly comes, male and female certainly comes. Why? Because there is day and night, there is light and darkness, there is sky and land, and then there is male and female. There is a clear progression or logic of supposed duality. That's how we would say a supposed duality. But is it so? Is it so? Let's consider this. If it is day and night, light and darkness, isn't there dawn? Isn't there dawn? Isn't there dusk? Dawn is not mentioned, dusk is not mentioned, but our experience of creation suggests that dawn is very much present, wherein which we cannot identify the boundary between light and darkness early in the morning, as if light subsumes into darkness, day subsumes into night, especially at dusk. And if you look at any religious tradition for that matter, not just Christianity, but if you look at any other religious traditions, these points of the day have been the most revelatory points, whether it be dawn or dusk. And these were separate, these were set apart for spiritual quests. Early in the morning, prayers are the ayans that you hear. Okay. Call to worship early in the morning, a compline in the evening, where in which dusk, that's where the monks would come to gather for prayers. Just because a certain thing is not explicitly mentioned in the scriptures does not mean it does not exist. I'll say that again, possibly much later. So it be the earth and sky. What about the boundless horizon that we have in space, wherein which we may not be able to say, where does earth end and the sky begins? There are these what we call liminal spaces, fluid spaces, wherein which we cannot differentiate which is which. Of course, this is the imaginative picture of someone would have guessed what is this in space. It's this imaginative picture of the black hole, as we know, okay, that which confounds scientists even today, wherein which sky and heavens all subsume into this gigantic gravitational space. Creation is beyond our imagination. How about water and land as separated, very clear, binary, water and land? What about coastlines? What about wetlands, wherein which we cannot be sure where is land and where is water? And as we see nature, these are the very spaces wherein which the creative force is evident. Fish spawn in these places. New life is regenerated in these wetlands, coastlines, wherein which fluidity is there, wherein which liminal spaces are there. We are unable to see whether it is clearly land or water. And then that leads us to this point, male and female, a binary. When we have known all these, that there has no actual binary in creation, because our experience suggests something else. And as I said, just because it is not explicitly mentioned in the scripture does not mean it does not exist. Certainly, a kaleidoscope exists of Suji communities, sexual orientations, and gender identities. It is for us, through God's power, to identify as well as discern humanity in all its abundance, just as we saw that the actual binary does not exist even in creation. Even in creation. And therefore, we certainly need an intersectional approach. We have always taken an intersectional approach, but from the sexuality and the gender point of view, discerning this convergence of multiple identities and also to respond and unmask discrimination is so evident, and it's so crucial when we begin this quest. And finally, we need to bring this ethical principle from Psalm 139, possibly instead of Genesis 1:26. Genesis 1:26 is useful and powerful, but then beyond this binary, we would narrate the psalmist's words that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Our frame was not hidden from us when we were made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. And to even think of intricate wovenness, even from a biological point of view, what we get is the helix, the DNA helix, as we know, so intricately woven in God's own hand. Sorry to be anthropomorphic, that's what it is. Such intricate wovenness in our own sexualities, in on those diversities, shouldn't we be praising rather than condemning? Is a question that we certainly need to ask. And as has been said, that the commandment not to oppress the other requires the peoples of God always to be open to people, ideas, and experiences that seem strange. That seems strange in the beginning, but is not strange at all. And that's why God self in the incarnation becomes vulnerable to human welcome. And it is for us to discern this vulnerability in us and certainly around us. And finally, these are certain things that can be seen as a takeaway, that sexuality is not simply a social issue, but certainly a justice issue. That we may perhaps need to move from this affirmation to this way of looking at it, to more so sexual orientation, gender identity that come to us from the community itself, and certainly perspectives from subaltern communities and people at the margins, where in which orientations and gender identities are clearly and evident, and we certainly need to not just provide but realize realistic alternatives within us. Thank you very much for your patient listening. It's just about 6:58, and there are just a few moments for any clarifications or questions that you do have throughout what we did as of now. Thank you. And I could have rephrased what I did, but it would take a bit of time, but I will stop here. And I'm sure there would be questions with regard to this. Thank you, and over to Jyoti.